We're Sainties.
St. Elizabeth University.
St. Elizabeth is the best kept secret in New Jersey. Here, turn your passion into your profession. St. E's has one goal: to support intelligent, determined young women and men, becoming the best people they are destined to be.
The power to learn.
The power to grow.
The power to succeed.
We're St. E's.
St. Elizabeth University. The power to soar.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the St. Elizabeth University Speaker Series for Spring 2025. My name is Dr. Rich Quinlan. I am the director of the St. Elizabeth Holocaust and Genocide Education Center, and it is my absolute honor to welcome today Dr. Mehnaz Afridi, an individual that I honestly can say is not just an incredibly respected educator, leader, speaker, scholar, but also a friend. Dr. Afridi is the director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University. Her work explores how the Holocaust has a profound effect of people of any faith. I was very honored to have her as a professor. And this text, her work, The Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, was the result of tireless years of effort interviewing and working with Holocaust survivors, as well as members of both the Jewish and Muslim communities. Her work reminds all of us to be cognizant of how we view ourselves as well as each other. And every time I get to work with her, I always do have to mention that this is very personal for me because Dr. Afridi was actually one of my dissertation readers. And I'm still convinced that when you said yes to that, you were either exhausted or suffering from a very high fever or something, but you agreed. And I will forever be indebted to you for all of your help and all of your work. So I present Dr. Mehnaz Afridi.
Thank you, Rich. I was just looking for my mic to put the voice on. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here. Um, Rich's dissertation was amazing, and it was on Rwanda, and I just want to say how much I learned about it. And now there's more stuff happening there, and I constantly go back to you, Rich, and your research, thinking about what's going on in Congo now, and things are very tense in that area of the world. But anyway, I'm just really grateful to be here. I wanted to share, Rich had asked me to share, work that I've done. I know that people are constantly thinking about what's going on politically in terms of the war, in terms of Israel and Gaza, and people are always constantly thinking about what's going on in terms of Jewish-Muslim relations. And I have tried really hard, even after October 7th, to maintain those relationships. But foremost, I'm an educator. I'm an educator that believes that education is the best form. Critical thinking is the best form that we can give to our children and our future generations. And of course, that includes my students. So I really wanted to just show some slides of the work I do. And I direct the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center, and I wanted to call this Connections and Dialogue. I think that connections is really important. Dialogue is very important. Self-critical thought is very important. But I also think very much, because I am from the Muslim faith, and I've studied Judaism and of course Christianity. I believe that humility, humanity, and connection is the message of all of our faiths, regardless of who you are. Next, please. So how do we develop community building and dialogue? Some of the practices that have worked for Jewish, Muslim, Christian communities, but also secular Americans from various political leanings. So I've been trying to do this work inclusive and trying to bring in people that we normally wouldn't see in certain spaces. And I think it's education, but also experiential education. And then the third aspect of doing this kind of work is how do you maintain that in a long-term, maybe community activity? Next, please. So we started off with an interfaith building event, which was between two my really, really close colleagues, Malka Simonovic and Rita Tichovic. And Rita does work on Muslim Catholic dialogue. She's a Catholic theologian, and Malka is Orthodox Jew, and she does a lot of work on Orthodox Judaism. And we had a conversation after October 7th about the challenges of these conversations. How do we think about this? But we're all from the background of religious studies and theology. And we also were very simple, very honest, I should say, about the issues that waver around us in terms of politics. But we wanted to affirm the connections that we had in our traditions as quote unquote the Abrahamic faiths. Next, please. So we did a community building event where we did an interfaith dinner, and we also have collaborated with the Riverdale Y, and we invited Jews, Muslims, and Christians together. We had conversations, and we talked about spiritual life, but also how to build our communities and not to let go of each other, even with the politics looming around us today. Next, please. I was very lucky. I had Iman Dean as a doing an internship with me for the summer for the Holocaust Archive at Manhattan University. She learned for the first time education about the Holocaust, story of survivor that I've built an exhibit about, Herman Ziering, and she learned archivist skills. And the reason I think this is an important slide is that you can introduce young people to this kind of work by offering internships, by offering certain research projects that are from different kind of communities and areas. So she's a Muslim from Sri Lanka. She spent her time here. She's at NYU now, and she does design project work. So it was really incredible working with her. Next, please. I did a conference with Elie Wiesel Foundation. Alicia Wiesel is a partner. I'm on their grants committee as well. And it was tough bringing people together. This was in April. And but we were partnering with unlikely partners. We had Jews, Muslims, Christians. We had the Uyghur Human Rights Center there. We had Uyghur female victims speak and survivors, and we had an interfaith prayer. And we were really educating each other in faith, history, and genocide. And the Elie Wiesel Foundation, I have a deep respect for, has spent a lot of energy and time on the Uyghur genocide in China. Thank you. Next. And then I did things like go to the Jewish Theological Seminary and talk with Dr. Schwartz and Dr. Boyce on violence and sacred texts. So how do we get to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? What do our texts tell us? How do we cherry pick things? How do we understand these things? We talk about extremism all the time, but where is this coming from, right? I think we ignore the fact that we have these sacred texts because we are in the context of the secular, but we were trying to look at actually violence in our own traditions. And we would interpret it literally, and then we would undo that literal interpretation to show how two different kind of interpretations can happen, both in Judaism and also in Islam. Next, please. I did a really wonderful like lecture, not my lecture, but so much so, but it was a great gathering. And I did a lecture on speaking up for the other. And I talked about our truth, our humility, and our hope. And the audience was interesting. I wanted to share this with you. It was Israeli, Palestinian, American Catholics, and students. So there were Muslims and Jews and Catholics. There were people who did not agree with each other. But at the same time, it was important for me to be raw and be honest about the relationship between Jews and Muslims, but also between Israelis and Palestinians. Next, please. I'm also the advisor to the Muslim Students Association. And what we did on our campus was different from other campuses that have, a lot of conflict and trauma going on. We did a humanitarian relief for Gaza. We did knowledge and education. in the group, and we had an interfaith iftar and peace prayer. We're having another one next Tuesday night where everyone is welcome. So it's for the 1 year anniversary of the Israel-Hamas war outbreak. Campus ministry and myself and others did a prayer of peace instead of a demonstration. And there were Israeli faculty, there was Palestinian and Muslim faculty that stood there and thought about peace, whether it was for their own community or for the other community. Next. I do a lot of student engagement and I get them involved with my events. I had a lecture on women's rights in Islam with Daisy Khan, who just wrote a book on women's rights, and they came and volunteered. And that's one of the ways of getting younger people involved with these issues of, okay, who is this woman? I got to talk to her, understand her life story. So it wasn't just reading a book. And then I bought some books and gave them to students who were interested. And then we had our lecture on Kristallnacht with Michael Birnbaum, who's a good friend, also a mentor from LA. And we were able to do these events after October 7th. There were Muslim students in the audience. There were, I think there were a couple of Jewish students. We don't have a lot of Jewish students because we are a Catholic university, but I really welcome Jewish students because I think they would really benefit from what we do at Manhattan University and also our mission, which is, of course, maintain peace, but also dialogue on the campus. Next, please. So Dervish Hizarki from Berlin is a Turkish German who lives in Berlin, and he has a organization. Actually, they just cut his budget, which is disheartening. But he worked on, and still works on anti-Semitism in Muslim communities. And he came and talked to my class. I teach a class called Muslims and the Holocaust, which we'll get into as we move along. And he shared his own work as a Muslim. He shared work on anti-Semitism. He shared how there was indeed Islamophobia in Germany and how he tries to balance that and how he does trainings for Muslim communities in Berlin. Next, please. We also did a huge interfaith breakfast. I was the co-chair for AJC, American Jewish Committee at Iona College, and it was really important to be role modeling as interfaith leaders. We were asked questions on a panel about what's going on and how we think and how we could maybe suggest a couple of things for the audience to could maintain dialogue and critical dialogue as we moved into December and the new year. Next, please. These are presentations that my students did in my Women in Islam class. And I think it's important that we also understand that Islam and Muslim communities have art. They have a long history of philosophy. They have a history of bringing actually good movements to the world through our Prophet Muhammad, but also for the students to understand that the kind of perception of Muslims, which is, rehashed over and over again as the terrorists or the face of Hamas, there is something completely different in terms of the majority Muslim world. Next, please. I belong to a consortium of Holocaust, genocide, and human rights scholars, and we had our consortium conference in Alabama, which was a state that was hit quite badly back in October by the state legislation in terms of DEI and diversity and human rights. So we went there to support our colleagues at the University of Alabama and how to navigate these conversations. So this is back in October, not after the new election. So I try to reach out to people and try to give them some hope and some bridge building and also support in terms of being the director of the center, but also just a friend and a colleague. Next, please. So I'm on the IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, State Department member, and I gave a presentation in London on community building today on campus and society. Because a lot of people in Europe are also frustrated with how to talk about these issues, these difficult issues that are happening on campuses, but also between Muslims and Jews, just in general, in communities. And that was really, truly an honor because it was the opening panel. Next, please. And I was in Sarajevo also doing interfaith work and peacemaking in Bosnia. As you know, Bosnia went through a genocide, and some things have risen up that are tense for Bosnia and neighboring Serbia. And so I wanted to talk about maybe how this was important. I mean, some people agreed with it, some people didn't, but it was really a marvelous panel discussion on how to do this in different countries, take the work we do in the United States to other places, but understand the context that they're in. Next, please. This is our interfaith prayer for Peace Day. Campus ministry and a rabbi, Linda Schreier, came. We have really good relationships with the synagogues in the area in Riverdale, and also with the Christian churches, and we have the Mosque Abrar, and we also have people who come from the Bronx to do interfaith or interfaith iftar. So we try to represent everybody. We also have had Hindus and Buddhists come to our campus, but the Buddhists are quite close, but the Hindus are quite far. So it's not that we're closed off from other faiths. We just don't have the proximity for all of them. Next, please. So Rich also asked me to talk about my book, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes. So I wrote this book. Now you know something about my work and what I do actively as a director. And of course, I put on about 8 events a year. But, I am essentially a scholar and a teacher. And I wanted to write this book because I was very frustrated, honestly, by the lack of knowledge of the Holocaust in my community, and also the anti-Semitism or the mythology, stereotypes of Jews that I was hearing from, Asian Muslims, Arab Muslims, etc. And I think some of it has to do with Israel and Palestine, and interfaith work pre October 7th did discuss that. But I think a lot of it had to do with the influences of European colonialism, but also the lack of knowledge of the Holocaust, period, um, or the lack of knowledge of what happened to Jews, or where Jews were coming from, or who they were, or their tradition. And I thought that was a big problem. So I wanted to really, really talk about that, and also interview survivors, and just basically acknowledge as a Muslim woman that indeed, in fact, historically, what happened during the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were killed, was accurate. I know that sounds probably simplistic, but it needed to be said on paper. So how do I teach this, and what do I want out of it? So one of my goals is I want us to look at stories that have been forgotten, and stories that perhaps can create a conversation around Jewish and Muslim cooperation during the Holocaust. The Holocaust also took part in North Africa, and I think it's important that I show that these connections of the history of 2 communities and how important they were. Some of my students who are Muslim um, don't realize that there are Jewish Arabs until they take my class, which is called Muslims in the Holocaust. And, Jewish students don't realize any of the history of the colonization that took place, and why indeed the Vichy government took over the many parts of North Africa. So there's this disconnect of historical understanding of who Jews are and who Muslims are. And so I wanted to make, sort of connect these stories in a way where it was important for us to see each other differently and out of those mythological stereotypes. So, for example, we think Muslim Arab, but that's 20% of the population of Muslims. So the highest is Asian Muslim, then African, and then Arab. There's 1.9 billion Muslims. So if we just think of that, there are Jews from everywhere as well, as we know. So or the fact that Jews were in Europe for 1,000 years. So these questions, even though they seem simplistic to some of us, are not obvious facts or histories or historical consciousness that our students have. I want to say that this class in particular is one of the most popular in our in the electives or in the requirements in terms of religious studies. So I also think that students are indeed curious, and they see Muslims in the Holocaust, they think it's an oxymoron. But as a matter of fact, there are a lot of interesting connections. Next, please. So this is just a map that I think is really useful for us in case we don't really know that, what was going on in Africa in 1940. And the key shows you who was controlling what. You see the British control in terms of Egypt and Sudan. You see the Vichy French control, which is Algeria and French West Africa. So the key helps us think about, wow, look at the Italian control, right? I always say to my students, what's the capital of Libya? They'll say Tripoli. I said, no, it's Tripoli, right? And I'm trying to connect with them in terms of languages. What do they speak in Morocco? Arabic and French. Algeria. So there's this whole history that they go through. And who was there? It was not just Muslims, but there were Jews and Christians, Arabs that lived there, and they all lived together and shared some actually religious rituals as well. And that's a fascinating history that we never really touch on. But through my class, and I think Rich took this at Graz, was we talked about the Jewish Arab and Muslim Arab relations, the play of the colonial divide, the question of citizenship versus being on a temporary sort of status as Muslims that believed that they were natives, which they were Arabs, but they also were African. Then we talk about the different um, camps, the camps in Morocco, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Libya. And, the camps were not just for the Jews, but they also were for Muslims and Christians. They were there for labor. They used all the labor they could. There are wonderful stories and a diary that I particularly really focus on in my book, which talks about Muslim and Jewish cooperation during this time and in the camp together, because they actually bonded together in a way that was incredible. So these stories have kind of been forgotten. We've forgotten the history of Jews in the world, um, that are Arab, that are Mizrahi, that are not Ashkenazi, but we also have forgotten the history of Muslims and how Muslims built things or cooperated with Jews. And I think these are extremely important stories, because if we just politicize behind the banner of flags and nationalism and the conflict between Israel and Gaza, or Hamas and Israel, I think we just lose sight of each other's humanity, and we are forced, or in a way, the social media and the language around us is forcing us into a corner of choosing. It doesn't mean that you don't choose um, a side because you're ethical and just, but it also means you listen to everybody and try to understand the complexity of it. I also teach that the Holocaust and colonialism is not a comparison. But the question that I ask is that, can we understand one another's historical context at different times? A very important moment was the mass immigration of Jews into Palestine, um, and the lack of education of people on the ground, both Jewish as well as Muslim and Christian, not understanding this mass immigration. The lack of knowledge of what was going on in camps, for example, and especially Eastern Europe, these kind of connections were lost. And there was this sort of moment where Arabs saw the Jews that were migrating because they were European as another European colonialism. I think the Holocaust, understanding the Holocaust and colonialism, provides an understanding of power structures, right? Who is in power? What is power? What is native? What is non-native? These questions come up all the time. But also it defines the many challenges that we face today among Jews and Muslims. I want to remind you that in the United States, Muslims are less than 1%, Muslim Americans, and Jews are 1.2%. That's it. But the level of discrimination, religious discrimination, is against Jews and Muslims in terms of highest percentage. And that's just phenomenal if you look at the percentages of the religious Jewish Americans and Muslim Americans. I also think Muslims and the colonial memories and boundaries is important to talk about. The way that Muslims and Arabs perceived this kind of moment of exchange, but also of being colonized. It's also important to see how people who were escaping, immigrating to Palestine, believed in Zion, their home. And again, Zionism is another section I do in my classes to talk about the history of Zionism, and not just a political word that is used in terms of extremism. So I think these are important things to be teaching, and they're historical, you might say. And what do kids care about? But they actually do, because they're all connected to our present realities. And that's what I'm trying to bring in, is how is this connected? What is Zion? What is biblical Zion? And people, they'll say Zionism is, it's a form of killing Palestinians. That's sort of what they've learned. That's huge, right? So we need to educate. What was the role of Muslims under the Vichy? I mean, they played the role of bystander. They played the role of being the victim, but they also played the role of being the rescuer. I love these images because it shows you a woman in hijab in France reading Le Monde. She's clearly, reading both French and Arabic, and it's just this quintessential photograph of the colonized Muslim woman during that time. And then the other side shows a family of Muslims that were moved from places under the Vichy government, Arabs, and then also, of course, Jews. What's also interesting about North Africa, which connects the audiences to Jewish persecution, is that people who were visiting, for example, Morocco as Jews, were also persecuted. And there are instances and examples of Jews being taken all the way to Auschwitz to be exterminated, all the way from North Africa, which is just crazy. It's an important story, though, because students can't imagine that, or audiences can't think about that. But when they start to realize this kind of wanting to basically kill every Jew by the Vichy and the Nazi party, then things become really stark, and they become really something that sticks with the audiences and the students themselves. And this is kind of the work I have been doing, and I've of course expanded on it. I've looked at what were Muslims doing in certain places, why were they uh, being deported, and they were caught in actually World War II. And I took a group of 52 Jewish and Muslim women through the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom as our teacher to Auschwitz. And there we read the names of 61 Muslim victims at Auschwitz. So, these, you're like, what? How does that happen? Muslims were not something that the Vichy or the Nazis were really engage in saving. They wanted relationships with the Arab world because they were losing allies, but they were not really invested. I mean, in terms of how they looked at Muslims and Arabs was also subhuman. Next, please. And then here's a woman that I really admire. Her name is Inayat Nur Khan. She is an Indian Muslim woman rescuer, and she was killed at Dachau. But she and her brother were raised in um, under her father, who was a very famous Sufi spiritual man who had traveled to the United States. Her mother was American, but also a convert to Islam. And she decided that when fascism broke out, Nazism broke out, she decided to join the British force. She was very good uh, at her handwork and writing letters. And so she became a British spy, which is very unheard of at that time for a woman. And she risked her life in trying to save Jews and give messages back and forth to try to tell people um, where the Nazis were coming, or the Vichy government was trying to find where any Jew was alive or living. So she's kind of a heroine of mine because I'm from South Asia. I'm from Pakistan originally. And she always kind of makes me proud that she brings these stories together for me in terms of my own work. Next, please. Khalid Abdul Wahab is also a very interesting man who was a rescuer at Tunisia. He knew the SS guards, and he was in the eastern shore of Tunisia. And in 1942, Khalid ferried 24 Jews to his own van in the dead of the night to his estate 20 miles away. There, he protected them from the Germans unit in the area until May 1943, when his guests were able to depart safely. So, again, a lost story. Why did he do that? Because he thought it was wrong. It was necessary for people to um, rescue others, even if it meant they were risking their lives. And I think these stories also start to bring out the humanity in us, no matter who we are, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, secular. I don't really have any judgment. And they tell a story of how people in places like Tunisia, or for Inad Nur Khan, who went to France, and she was in France and she was a spy, kind of how Muslims did have a small role in what was going on in terms of World War II. I also think it's important to say that, a lot of these Muslim rescuers and Arab rescuers sadly have not been acknowledged, especially Arab, by um, Yad Vashem has acknowledged a couple of them, and an Egyptian, actually doctor, but the family has not wanted to take the award because Yad Vashem is in Israel. So it brings us all the way up to these contemporary issues, right? And that also can be a conversation that's important for us to have as as educators, as community people, as students, but most importantly, as why is that happening? What's the purpose of that? But the most important thing for me would be the story itself of Khalid Abdul Wahab, or Dr. Helmi, who was an Egyptian doctor. So it is here, the slide. So I was interviewed by ABC News on campus climate, and I basically have to say that one of the most important things for me as an educator and as someone at Manhattan University is to say, you can have freedom of speech, but not freedom of hate. And that to me is our mission. And I think it's so important for universities to have a mission, or for our center at Manhattan University to understand that if you if you're a student and you use certain words and don't even know that's hate speech, it's important that we create that community where we say, what you just said about Jews or Muslims is very hurtful and it's hateful. And this is why. And that's why I think Holocaust, genocide, interfaith education is crucial for all of us. And also the question of, we've also done the question in my religion and Holocaust class about genocide and what that means, and even looking at the court cases against Israel recently, which is tough work, I have to be honest with you. But it needs to be done, not just in the courts or not just the governments, but it has to be done by people to actually look at these problems and why this is so painful. Next, please. Thank you. So I think I'm just going to leave it there. I know that Rich has a couple of questions for me. And
Thank you as always. That was typically remarkable. Thank you, Mehnaz, for your time and for your expertise and for everything that you shared with us today. I do have a couple of questions for you, and I also have a great question that was sent to me by one of the people taking part in today's program. I wanted to start, you speak so much about your role and your responsibility as an educator and all the work that you do with young people. And you mentioned social media at one point in today's presentation. And the line that you use, that social media seems to force us to make a choice. And we know how influential social media is in the lives of younger people who are going to eventually take the mantle and lead programs on faith someday. So how do you go about trying to use social media as a tool and an instrument of good and change, rather than let it be what it's too often described as, which is sort of this just this ecosystem of more hatred?
me personally, or how do I teach about social media? Because there's two
Both,
different
a
things.
little bit, if you
Okay.
don't mind, both, because you
Okay.
also have an extraordinary social media presence.
Yeah, I mean, I have LinkedIn, Instagram. I have an HDI Facebook page. I'm not on TikTok, but I usually try to post, events, but also positive stories of community building. I don't necessarily have the algorithm, and I was actually discussing this with my students, where I just see hate. If you want to look at my Instagram, it's basically cats, travel, and tennis. So, that's sort of like my personal, right, page that, and of course, I love cats, I love traveling, and I love tennis. So those three things are constantly on my feed, which keeps me really busy, because that's like, at least for 20 minutes of my day. And then I'm like, okay, now move on. Like, I gotta go do work, I gotta go write or teach or whatever. But what I do with my students, and it seems to be working, is that, for example, we're in spring break, so they have an assignment to find an article that is not less than 1,000 words, because they won't read that much from anywhere on social media, um, about basically Islamophobia in the last 7 days, right? My Holocaust class has had assignments about, um, how many universities are actually having these demonstrations, and how many Jewish students are being affected by anti-Semitism. But what's interesting is that they bring me articles from different sites, right? And some of them have two different stories about the same issue. And we actually spend some time in class looking at that. And then maybe one of them will pick it up as a research project. So one of the ways of teaching about social media is not stopping social media and not stopping them from using it, but giving them tools and skills of how to use social media and how to actually learn from social media. And there were a lot of, I'll give you a really stark example. There were a lot of fake videos after October 7th, about October 7th. A bunch of kids came to me, Muslim kids, and said, Dr. Afridi, we need to talk to you. And I said, sure. And they said, did did October 7th really, was it really Hamas? And I was like, yes. And they're like, look at this. And there was three of them. They were showing me all these videos, and they were fabricated videos of actually IDF creating October 7th. Now, I sat with them and talked to them for a long time. And they understood. They were like, wow, this is just crazy, right? What's going on? But there are not a lot of people that will do that. And they don't have a lot of people that they can go to and say, hey, is this real? I mean, my daughter can, right? And she does. If she sees something that is so extreme or is hateful, she will always come down and say, Mama, is this real? And I mean, I think so. At least she has the tools because she's been raised here. Or I've always said, be suspicious, but be critical, but be informed, be educated, read good books. I mean, she reads actual books. So the thing is that how do we teach people to use social media? And I think social media is an engine that has destroyed people's lives. I mean, kids as well included.
Mhm.
So what is the responsibility of that? And I think there's a lot of conversations that go on. Actually, a lot in Europe, even at IRA, where there's a lot of Holocaust distortion. There's a lot of AI videos that are
Mhm.
not true about the Holocaust. I mean, Holocaust is really being hit in terms of fake news and distortions of facts.
Yeah, so the need of digital literacy and media literacy in general, I mean, is that something where uh, we should start to see that implemented in as an actual class, or at least segments of a class beginning even in, say, middle school? Because while we'd love to think that social media is just for 16 and up, or whatever the age is that some politicians have talked about trying to restrict it, younger and younger people see this. And so we always talk about, and I know you and I have had this conversation, that education has to be the beginning to every, it's the starting answer to every problem. Um, is there a way that we can start to formalize this to help students recognize deep fake videos and all of the other traps that are out there for them?
I think there are, first of all, I want to say there are courses on digital literacy media all over, in many universities, and we also in communications teach it. But I think, when the kids are that young, it has to be from the household, right? Like it's really hard to, I mean, part of what we're seeing in terms of hate in high schools, or hate crimes in middle schools, which actually exist,
Mhm.
because I've been talking to these high schools or middle schools, is their home environment.
Yeah.
Um, home environment, their peer groups, and social media, right? So your algorithm becomes your peer group, or your the way that you're raised, right? The what you believe in terms of being raised. So I think there is education, but I think there's also education. And that's why I think community building is important, because people who come for community events are parents, right? Or leaders in other communities. And I think that's the impact that I think is really important today.
And thank you so much for sharing that story too about your daughter. At least we know she's going to have a positive influence on her peer group, and she can be a leader in her own right. So thank you. I do have a question that was sent to me, and I think it's fantastic because you were talking so much about the work you do in class and the kind of class discussions that you have. And admittedly, obviously, they're not always easy. And so one of our participants today asked, does it ever come up in class discussions when talking about peace that Israel has embraced the many bordering Arab areas offering citizenship, work, and medical benefits, but the Palestinian governments have more often than not chosen hateful rhetoric and extremism. Why is Israel singled out for colonialism when there are 22 Arab states and one Jewish state? So again, it's a profound question. Um, I'd love to hear your.
Yeah, it's a really big question, but let me I think the last part is really important, and thank you for that. Is why is Israel singled out, right, in terms of the colonial? I think it's the timing, right? It's exactly the timing. And um so in the Ottomans fell in 1919, but there was also the Balfour Declaration. There was also this kind of angst about colonization. So the colonial impression was not just, it was not about Jews, which is what I think most people don't understand. It was just about Europe. We don't want another European coming in and colonizing us, right? Even though there were Jews in Palestine, but there was this pushback against it because it was like, okay, we're going to get rid of this. I mean, look, Algeria had a huge resistance movement. There were so many Arabs and African countries that were trying to resist colonization. And then to see, and there's a physical aspect to this, a visual aspect to this, because seeing, Russian Europeans or German European Jews, right? I didn't do the thumbs up, but whatever, coming in was physically like, oh, they're Europeans. There was no like sort of like, okay, you're all wearing a yarmulke. No, it was not about that. And I think there is this one moment of that impression, and the fact that the British had promised Palestine a state and the Jews a state. I also think that colonial move became like, oh no, there's a base here for the Europeans at that time than Americans, to kind of control the Middle East. That was that moment that had happened. Why is it treated differently? Because it's right. The impression was it was right in the middle of this chaos of colonization, and the support it got so quickly from a majority of the Western countries, including, of course, us, the United States, to recognize it right away. And that became a blow. And I'm not saying that it should be a pariah state. Listen, I'm from Pakistan. There's a lot of issues. I understand. There's a lot of issues in our countries, human rights violations, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that is that moment that never sort of like got thought about. Certainly not by politicians or Hamas or any Arab kind of government or the Israeli government either, right? There's this kind of time and moment where two groups of people, one that is escaping from persecution, right? Death, and one that is just getting over and saying, get out of my country to the European powers. And then boom, it's right there. Right. So that's why it became like the 21st century issue. The Israel Palestine issue is a question for all of us. It's about identity. It's about religion. It's about belonging. It's about human rights. It's about democracy. It's about, how do we define ourselves? And this problem is not just about Israel and Palestine. Look, I'm from Pakistan. My mother was very, very young when she left India, and she and her family lost everything. Same with my dad. So, and that took unfortunately, there were 1.2 million people who died with the partition of India and Pakistan. And again, there was a rule. The British were there. There was people say it was Hindu or Muslims, but there was all kinds of stuff that went on in terms of that. So I think it's important to say this is not the only case in the world. There are similar times, or similar cases, but that because of the timing of Israel becoming a country, it was seen as a pawn of the West, not necessarily just a Jewish state.
How much does anti-Semitism also play in as kind of a follow-up to that question in talking about Israel being signaled out? How much would you attribute that also to a sense of anti-Semitism?
I think definitely anti-Semitism is part of it, because if you don't study anything about Judaism or Israel, the history of Jews, and all you see is Israel or cartoons of Israel or the IDF or power or killing of Palestinians, that's what you grow up with. Right? We're talking about social media. So I think that definitely plays into it. The mistrust between Jews and Arabs plays into it. Both sides, actually, I would say. And also the idea that somehow the mythological or the myths that were held in Europe about anti-Semitism seeped into a lot of the part of the Arab world. So you can look at this is what I talk about in my book. There's a whole section on where you see anti-Semitism and how you see it. So it's a really important question, but it's a question that has to go all the way back to, I would say, the late 1800s onwards.
Thank you. So I know we're running out of time, so I want to leave on a note of talking a little bit about the future.
Mhm.
You're on a college campus, you speak around the world, you work with so many young people and everything that you do. And I know there's a lot of young people out there who want to go into interfaith work and think tanks and NGOs and the nonprofit community. But with some of the struggles that those organizations are facing right now, what advice do you have for someone in your class or someone that you encounter at a conference who says, I want to commit my life to doing that kind of nonprofit work, but it looks like, it looks like there's so many things stacked against us right now. What do you tell them?
It's a question I've thought about a lot, especially last year. Well, I think there's always going to be work for this, right? It's not like human rights are over, right? I wish that was true, right? I wish I could just have a one and say, okay, it's all, it's over. So now let's really look at history and do the stuff academics like to do, right? Research and all that. But there's always going to be work for human rights people, for Holocaust, genocide. Genocides have not stopped. So we still have a lot of work to do. My advice to my students has always been, do what you love, carve out a niche. You don't think you're going to get all this money, but you know what? You might end up doing okay. That's like the going advice I have if they want to do that. So, and this is, I had no idea what I was going to do with religious studies. People, I'm Muslim, so they were like, okay, you can't be a nun. So it was really hard being, me and studying what I studied.
Yeah.
So it was a whole series of struggles and challenges of being a Muslim woman and teaching Islam, or being a Muslim woman and teaching the Holocaust was very challenging. And when I did get the job, and Rich, you know this, there was a lot of pushback against me from the Jewish community because we didn't trust each other. But, I've been in this role for 14 years and I've built that trust. And they've recognized it. And I'm really pleased to say that. And that's how you role model. It takes a while. It's not an overnight solution. I hope that 20% of my students in a class can say, wow, that was transforming. I can actually think for myself and walk out rather than, 100. But that's like a dream, right? And but you have to be idealistic but realistic at the same time. It's like there's two things you have to do as a teacher and also a person who does basically Jewish Muslim relations today. So I have a lot of hope.
Well, and listening to you and reading your work and seeing everything you do should give people hope. And I thank you so much for your time today. You might be the busiest person I've ever met. I know you're constantly doing 2, 3, 4 different conferences and interviews and things per day. So I thank you so much for making time for St. Elizabeth. I am so I so value your views, your intellect, your expertise, and your time. And once again, I suggest to everyone, please, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes. It's a life-changing read. It honestly was for me in 5 years of a doctoral program. Your class was above and beyond.
You're so sweet.
It honestly was, and there are enough people on these things to know I'm not just saying this. I don't say this when it comes on. It was truly just one of the most. It changed my entire view on so many issues geopolitically and historically. So thank you for everything that you've done and everything that you continue to do. I wish you the best of luck. Stay safe in all your travels, and your daughter and your students are incredibly lucky to have you in their lives. So thank you so much, Mehnaz.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Take care and keep hope and peace alive.
Have a great day,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.